A greeting to you, my good friends. A number of you had asked me for some linguistics, and if all goes well, this will be the first video in a series on that topic. What is language? How does it work? Those are the questions we'll be exploring. What I present will be in accordance with a theory called cognitive grammar, but I don't want to present to you the theory. I want to talk about language. And you judge, does this make sense? Does this fit with how you have experienced language and how you see it work? I hope it will be helpful. It's been helpful to me, and so I gladly present it to you. To start off with, at the very heart of language is something that we can call symbols. Symbols are cases where there is a significant structure that is attached to a signified structure. The typical case is that it's a word or something that somebody pronounces. Another way to say it is that there is a form connected to a meaning, and that constitutes a symbol. Let's look at the typical case. Here's a person that has an idea in his mind, and that idea is connected to a series of movements of the mouth and other parts of the body which produce a sound. The sound carries through the air to the ear of another person. That other person, on hearing the sound, has awakened in his mind a series of routines that recognize the sound, connected to the way the person himself would have pronounced the sound. That structure is then connected to an idea in the second person's mind, the hearer's mind. And if all goes well, it'll be the same idea as was in the speaker's mind. All right, let's go over it again. I am the speaker. In fact, that's how we're going to have to define linguistically the first person singular is the one emitting the signal. Okay, I as speaker have to have in my mind ahead of time a connection between a certain idea and a certain set of movements of my mouth that produce a sound. And then that sound will go across the airwaves to you, the hearer, and that's again how we'll define second person, is the hearer. And in your mind, the sounds that you perceive will awaken that same idea, and that connection has to be established ahead of time for us to be able to communicate. That's the way language works. Now I'm talking about speaker and hearer, but of course those are prototypes or most common cases for a wider concept which we could call the communicator and the communicatee or something. But I'm going to keep talking about speaker and hearer, and just understand that this will apply equally to the writer and the reader, or to the one making signs if you're talking sign language, and the one seeing the signs, or the one pressuring the other person's hand and the one feeling the pressure. Whatever means the communication takes, the speaker controls some phenomenon that the hearer can perceive. There's an interesting asymmetry between first and second person hidden in here, by the way. It's relatively easy for a group of people to simultaneously perceive something, but it's a lot harder for a group of people to simultaneously control something. As a result, you can see that it's not very easy for first person plural to mean multiple speakers, because people don't speak in unison. And if they do, they get just enough off to make it really hard to perceive what they're saying. Generally, it's one person that's speaking, but it could be a group of people that are perceiving. So a second person plural is likely to be multiple hearers, or multiple perceivers of whatever medium of communication we're talking about. Interesting little fact there. First person plural doesn't mean multiple speakers. It means the speaker and a group of people with whom he is associated for some reason other than his actual speaking, for what it's worth. So then, whatever phenomenon it is that constitutes the form, that phenomenon is already ahead of time connected in the speaker's mind with a particular meaning, and in the hearer's mind with the same meaning. The heart of things then in this picture is that link between a meaning and a form. Because you can have a thought in your mind, but it's not a meaning until you link it to some form. And you can have a form, you can make noises, you can make drawings like a writing if you'd like, but it isn't until those are linked in your mind and in someone else's mind with whom you are communicating that they constitute part of a language. The link then we're going to be calling a symbolic link, and the complex structure that's formed by connecting a meaning with a form is a symbol. So the heart of language is that symbolic link. As long as the same meaning is connected to the same form in two different people's minds, communication is possible. That's how language works. Now I said they're the same. They're not exactly the same. They are two separate instances of the symbol that is constituted by a meaning connected to a form. The idea that the speaker has in mind and the idea that the hearer is going to get in the end aren't exactly the same, but they better be pretty close to the same, or else we'll have to say the communication failed. In just the same way, the two phonological structures have to be very similar. Similar enough to be recognized as the same thing for the communication to work. Because if the hearer thinks it's a different symbol than the speaker intended, the hearer is going to get the wrong meaning. The communication won't work. A really important implication of this way of looking at things is that there is no direct contact between one mind and the other. You can't just take a meaning or even a phonological structure and just put it in another person's head. The communication is only via the signal. That's important to remember. Here's another important thing to think about. It is not the case that the meaning travels even directly with the signal. The signal doesn't have any meaning apart from what it's connected to in the minds of the speaker and the hearer. It's not like each little word is a mule and it has its load of meaning and the mules all travel together from one place to another, each mule carrying its meaning. That's a way that we sometimes think about language or talk about it, and I'm going to call it the Mule-Train Metaphor, but I'm going to suggest it's not a good way to think about language much of the time. Or at least we need to be very careful of it. Some of its implications can be unhelpful to us if we hang on to them. It's sort of an elaboration of another metaphor that's very basic, that is so basic that it's hard to talk about language without using it. And that's a container metaphor. It's easy to talk as if a form contains a meaning. I'm referring to the idea that linguistic forms are like boxes, and inside them is the treasure that's the meaning. And I'm suggesting it's not such a good way to think about things. It works better to think of it as connections. One other point I'd like to make, it's reasonably easy to convince people that meanings are cognitive entities, that they happen in our minds. And I'd like to maintain that phonological structures just as truly are cognitive. It's true that there's a signal that has to be outside of us in some sense and perceptible to the person we're interacting with, but the important work of phonology is done in the planning and production phase of the phonological signals going out and in the reception and analysis phase. And both of those are completely cognitive. They take place in a person's mind. So when you're studying language, whether it's semantics or phonology that you're doing, it's cognitive stuff that you're looking at. Here's a specific example. Let's think of a Mihe speaker who says the word duck and another one who hears it. Notice that the way I've diagrammed this, the meanings that are pre-existent in the two people's minds are not exactly the same. For one person, the prototype of the meaning of duck is one kind of a house, and for the other, it's a different kind of a house. But each one of them accepts the kind of house that's prototypical for the other. So even though the meaning that's uppermost in the speaker's mind is not exactly the same as the meaning that's uppermost in the hearer's mind, they're very similar. In the same way, the phonological shapes aren't quite the same either. The speaker, we're figuring, says the word duck with his tongue a little bit further forward in the mouth. And the hearer is more used to pronouncing it a little further back and hearing it a little further back. And so when he hears this pronunciation with it a little bit forward, he translates it into his own mind into the structure duck, which is a little further back than duck. But the two sounds are so similar that they count as the same, and the two meanings are similar enough that they count as the same. So the communication is successful. But what do you think would happen if we had speakers of another language involved? Suppose it was the same Mije speaker saying the same word, but a Spanish speaker heard him. What's that Spanish speaker going to think? I don't know. What did he say? I haven't a clue. What if it was an English speaker? An English speaker might think he said tuck, because tuck sounds a little bit like tuck. Would that be a better situation than the Spanish speaker was in? Not really. Might even be worse. You got a wrong meaning interfering with the right meaning this time. Well, you got to know the system. You have to know the language the other person's speaking in order to understand what the other person is saying. That's just the way the system works. Let's talk for a bit about the symbolic link or symbolizing link that we've said is at the heart of language. What's its nature? I'm going to suggest that it's simply an association. An association is the kind of connection that is born in our minds when repetitively we co-activate two structures, two thoughts, two ideas. And if they keep getting co-activated, we establish a connection such that thinking of the first one brings to mind the second, and thinking of the second one brings to mind the first. So if you're used to thinking of a place where people live and activating the sound house, they're going to get associated. And from then on, when you're thinking of a house, you're likely to think of the sound house. And if you hear the sound house, it's quite predictable that the meaning of a place where people live will come to mind. One of the founders of modern linguistics was Ferdinand de Saussure. Don't know if I pronounce his name right, but anyhow. One of Saussure's big points was that the linkage between a meaning and a form is arbitrary. So he was always talking, or at least his followers have always talked about the arbitrariness of the sign. What did he mean? Well, he was talking about the fact that you cannot predict what sounds are going to be linked to what meanings. If you're talking English, if you think of a place where people live, you'll think house. And if you're talking Spanish, you'll think casa. And if you're talking German, guess what? You'll think house. But if you're talking French, you'll think maison. And if you're talking Nahuatl, you'll think calli. And if you're talking Quechua, you'll think wasi. And if you're talking Zapotec, you'll think liji. And so on. Different languages have different sounds associated with very similar meanings. Similarly, the same sound, or at least a very similar one, in different languages can have different meanings. In English, we use the sound with an N and the long O, as we call it. Know to mean be cognitively aware of something or to have something stored in your mind. We also use it to mean a negative. In Spanish, it means the negative, but not the knowledge. In Nahuatl, it could be a possessive, meaning my. Another meaning is it can mean also. And so it goes. In different languages, the same sound can have different meanings, or the same meaning will have different sounds in different languages. It's that the Saussureans are talking about when they talk about the arbitrariness of the linkage between a form and a meaning. But I'm going to suggest that we would do well to not use the word arbitrary, because I think it has implications that don't really fit. Arbitrary means I know that there is no connection. And I'd rather say, I don't know that there's no connection, but I don't know that there is a connection either. I can't expect there to be a connection, but I can't expect that there won't be a connection. Because sometimes, you see, there is a connection that is actually discernible. I'd like to encourage us to use instead, or to think at least instead, in terms of the word conventional. Conventional means that a group of people have gotten into the habit of doing something. So it's a shared habit that's conventional. Are the things people do reasonable all the time? Oh no. Very often we fall into conventions that don't make a lot of sense, but we do them anyway because it's conventional. On the other hand, do the habits that we fall into lack all reason? Are they always stupid and arbitrary and just happen by chance rather than with any thought or any reason behind them? Not either. Human actions are a mixed bag. Sometimes they make sense, sometimes they make less sense. But if you keep doing a human action over and over again in a group, the group gets into the habit of doing it. And that, I think, is closer to the real nature of language in general, but specifically of the linkage between a meaning and a form. Let me show you some examples where I think there is some reason for why people linked a particular meaning with a particular sound. One of the most famous cases is what's called onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia comes from two Greek words and it means doing your name. There are some words that mean a sound and the phonological form that's used sounds a whole lot like the meaning. One of the famous examples is cock-a-doodle-doo, which is the call of the rooster. And it's not arbitrary that we say cock-a-doodle-doo. On the other hand, it's not predictable either. You can look at a number of other languages. In French, it's cocorico, I understand. In Spanish, it's kikiriki. In Japanese, they say it's kokekeko. I don't remember what it is in Thai, but they all have onomatopoeic words for the rooster's call, but they're all different. You couldn't have predicted ahead of time exactly how it would be done in each language. Here's another example. What's the name of this letter? Why do we call it M? Because the sound that it represents is pronounced M, with your lips closed and the air coming out your nose. So a bilabial nasal is involved in the pronunciation of M. Does that make the sound predictable? No. In Spanish it's eme with an a on the end. Why should that be different? I don't know. In Greek it was mu. In Hebrew it's mem. And in other languages it's got other shapes. Here's another set of words that are a lot of fun for me. What's this sound called in English? I call it a clink. Does that make sense? On the other hand, what's this sound? I call that a clank. Now listen to this sound. I call that a clang. Can you hear the difference between clank and clang? Which is which? Well, the clang keeps ringing a while and the clank gets cut off. Isn't that interesting? And then there's a clunk, which is kind of like that sound, and a clonk that's a bit different, more like this maybe. It's the sound of something hollow. Makes a clonk sound. Clink, clank, clunk, clang, clonk. Those are cool words. And they're onomatopoeic in some degree. I mean, you can listen to the e, a, aw pattern or range and hear that those correspond with a bigger thing that's getting hit, different timbre of the ringing sound that's made. And then clang that keeps ringing and clank that gets cut off. That's cool. Why is it that in English we don't have a word cling that would mean to keep ringing with a clinking sound? In German they do have the word. I remember when I was a kid hearing the Vienna Boys Choir singing a Christmas carol that goes kind of kling, glöckchen, kling-a-ling-a-ling, kling, glöckchen, kling. And that means ring little bell, ring-a-ring-a-ring, ring-a-ling-a-ling. And you can hear how the word mimics the sound that it's naming. Well, why don't we do that in English? It would be reasonable if we did, but we don't. It's convention. It's just the way it is. So, once again, we see the convention tells us you can't demand that it be reasonable. Just because it seems reasonable to you doesn't mean that the language has to do it. On the other hand, it may very well. And if it does, well then it's being reasonable. It's reasonable, but not predictable. That to me is a very important distinction. A whole lot in language is not predictable, but it's reasonable if you stop and think about it. You couldn't have known that people would do it that way, but once you know that they do it that way, oh yeah, that makes sense. So it's conventional. It's not predictable. It's not necessarily with no reason behind it, but it might have some reason behind it. So if we say it's arbitrary, we're sort of implying, I know that there's no reason behind it. And if we say it's conventional, we're saying people got into this habit, and there may be some reason behind it, whether or not I see the reason, but maybe there isn't. There doesn't have to be. And that's a beauty of the notion of conventionality. There doesn't have to be a reason for anything that's conventional. It can exist just because people got into the habit. But if there is a reason, that can still be relevant. It's not arbitrary in the sense that we know that there's no reason behind it. All right, here's another word that I'd like you to learn. It's the word iconic, or its derivative, iconicity. When you've got onomatopoeia, you can say in a sense that the sound that you're pronouncing is an image or is a copy of the sound that you're talking about. And iconicity in general means that the linguistic form is parallel in some way to the form that it represents. One quick example, if you say, he slept before he ate, then you are mentioning the sleeping and the eating in the same time sequence that you're talking about. So that is an iconic use of the language. On the other hand, if you say he ate after he slept, you're mentioning them in a counter-iconic or backwards from iconic order. We're going to be talking about iconicity sometimes. But remember that onomatopoeia, when the word that you're pronouncing mirrors the meaning that you're trying to talk about, that's a kind of iconicity. And language has a lot of iconicity in it, and it's very useful, I think, to be aware of that. All right, so what can we say about symbolic links? Well, we can say that all of them are conventional associations between a meaning and a form. And we can say that some of them may well be arbitrary. That is, they may well have no reason at all behind the establishing of the link, but not all of them are arbitrary. Some of them are motivated or reasonable in some degree. And among the ones that are motivated and reasonable in some degree, a prominent subgrouping, are those that are onomatopoeic, that the form of the meaning mirrors a sound that is actually designated by the word. And there are other kinds of iconic connections that are there. There may well be other reasons for a word being used or a particular connection being established, and we'll not discount that possibility. But the important thing to say is that they're all conventional. Now, when the time comes to start defining what a language is, we're going to claim that all of the structures that constitute a language are conventional. They're habits of speech that a group of people have fallen into, or have gotten into, or have chosen to go into. They may have had reasons, or they may not have had any reasons, but these are the habits that are established. And one of the implications of that is going to be that any linguistic rule, any linguistic structure, any linguistic connection, if it's conventional, that's enough explanation for it. Those of you that have learned another language have probably had the experience at least once or twice of asking some speaker of the language, why do you do X? If the speaker answers you in such a situation and says, that's just the way we do it, that's enough reason. If there's any reason beyond that, that's frosting on the cake. Surprisingly often, there is frosting. Things in languages are not totally irrational and arbitrary and just happening by chance. All right, let's review what we've gone over today. In order to communicate, a speaker and a hearer need to share a meaning, a form that is linked to that meaning, and the linkage, the symbolic linkage between them. That structure of a meaning, a form, and the linkage between them is known as a symbol, and the linkage is called a symbolic link. The structures in the minds of speaker and hearer have to be very similar for communication to work. They don't have to be identical, and they often will differ in some little details, but they have to be nearly alike for us to communicate well. Meanings, the forms that symbolize or mean them, and the linkages between them are all conventional. Conventional means that something is a habit that a group has gotten into. The group then would include the speaker and the hearer. So it has to be conventional at least between the speaker and the hearer, but usually it's a larger group that shares a whole bunch of similar structures. If they're not conventional, they can't work right. Conventional structures are not necessarily reasonable or rational. They're not necessarily predictable, but they often are reasonable or motivated in some degree. Everything that is in a language is conventional. That means that whatever is in a language doesn't have to be the way it is unless people have to fall into that habit. Most of language is not in that situation. It is not inevitable. It's only somewhat reasonable. One of the kinds of reasonableness that is fairly often found is when the form parallels the meaning in some way, in such a way that you can see the form as a sort of distorted image of the meaning. This is called iconicity. One case that we saw where that's especially clear is the case of onomatopoeia, where a sound names a sound that it sounds like. And you can see, obviously, there was a reason for calling the sound by that name. For any of you that are really interested in seriously learning this, I have a couple of recommendations. Go to the page whose URL is listed here and get the book that's there. What we've gone over today is just the first part of chapter 1 of that book. I recommend you get it and read it. I also give you a little exercise here. Look at this list of words. Do you understand what each term is talking about? If you do, you've got a lot of what I was trying to get across. And then fit them into the blanks in this little quiz or exercise that's there. And then check out. Here's the answers. And if you got it right, you're well on the way to understanding. One final recommendation. If you can find somebody else who's interested in the topic, work it over with them. Go through the exercises and talk about the reading. That's a good way to make it conventional between the two of you. And once it's conventional between more than one person, it's a lot easier to remember and to hang on to. I look forward to seeing you again, and I hope this is useful information for you.